California Task Force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. It contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Children on average remain missing longer than non-black children. Black women and girls, in particular, go missing in numbers larger than their proportion of the population. Not only the police but also the media typically pay them less attention compared to missing white women and girls. Chapter 11. Unjust legal system. California. Violence against African Americans is similar in California. 211 statistics from California's Racial and Profiling Advisory Board's 2022 report, drawing on data from 18 law enforcement agencies, including California's 15 largest agencies, shows that police stopped a higher percentage of people perceived to be black for reasonable suspicion that the person was engaged in criminal activity than any other racial group. 212. 2020, African Americans made up about 7% of the population, but those perceived to be black made up 17% of people police stopped. 213 and 18% of the people police have shot or seriously injured, 214 and 20% of those killed by police. 215. Searched, detained on the curb or in a patrol car, handcuffed. Moved from vehicles. More people who the officers perceived as black than individuals they perceived as white. 216 search discovery rate analysis showed that individuals who police perceived as black had the highest search rate. 217 people perceived to be black were also more likely to have police use against them compared to people perceived as white. 218 police officers also reported ultimately taking no action during a stop, most frequently when stopping a person they perceived to be black. 219 suggesting there may have been no legitimate basis for the stop. Rest of the country, the Operation Pipeline program in California led to racial profiling in the state in a 1999 report by the California State Legislature. California Highway Patrol described Operation Pipeline enforcement efforts as a way to find illegal drugs by generating a very high volume of legal traffic enforcement stops to screen for criminal activity, which may include drug trafficking. 220 as one California Highway Patrol sergeant said in an interview. Numbers are guys make a lot of stops, you've got to kiss a lot of frogs before you find a prince. 221 California Highway Patrol canine units were involved in nearly 34,000 such stops in 1997 and only 2% of those stopped were carrying drugs. 222 in 1999. And Civil Liberties Union sued the California Highway Patrol and alleged that Operation Pipeline taught officers to stop Latino male drivers for little or no reason. 223 The California Highway Patrol admitted in court documents that its officers were twice as likely to stop black drivers than white drivers, and were more likely to ask black drivers for permission to search their cars than white drivers. 224. An analysis of data from 2000 to 2008 in California showed that African Americans were significantly more likely than white people to be arrested for a marijuana offense. 225 After the legalization of cannabis in California, reports indicated that black entrepreneurs who try to start new cannabis-related businesses face challenges and delays, including a slow licensing processes. 226 For an in-depth discussion of discrimination in licensure, see Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity. Americans are also increasingly victims of hate crimes both nationwide and in California according to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 48.5% of single-bias hate crime incidents were motivated by anti-black bias in 2019. 227 according to the California Attorney General's report on hate crimes in the state in 2020. 43% of single-bias hate crimes were motivated by anti-black bias. 228 anti-black bias events were the most prevalent of all types of hate crimes and increased 88% from 2019 to 2020. 229 high-profile incidents of police killing African Americans in California, such as Ezell Ford, Los Angeles; Kendrick McDade, Pasadena; Waukesha Wilson, Los Angeles; Anthony McLean, Oscar Grant, Oakland; Dijon Kizzee, Los Angeles; Richard Risher, Los Angeles; John Clark, Sacramento; and Alfred Olengo, San Diego. These deaths and many others nationwide have sparked increased activism and public awareness on the issue of police brutality. Activists established the first chapter of Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles, and it is now a global network of activists. 230 half of all killings by police in the U.S. go unreported in the USA National Vital Statistics System database, from which some analysis is drawn. Police departments throughout the state have histories of violence against African Americans. Los Angeles before the turn of the century, the city's police had a history of violence against other historically marginalized groups such as Native Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans as more African Americans moved to the city. Period between the 1920s to the 1960s was characterized by police brutality against African Americans and protests, such as the Watts Rebellion in 1965, much like many other historical events that are often considered riots. In Watts was a reaction to injustice or a rebellion. For further discussion of rebellions, please see Chapter 3, Racial Terror. 1980s, the Los Angeles Police Department, which is the largest department in California and one of the largest in the country, referred to black suspects as dog biscuits. 231 victims of police dogs sued and alleged that the department disproportionately used dogs in minority neighborhoods. In police dogs inflicting 90% of their reported bites on African Americans or Latinos. 232 in 2013, the special counsel to the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which is the largest sheriff's department in California and the country. African Americans and Latinos comprised 89% of the total individuals who were bitten by the department's dogs from 2004 to 2012. 233 during the same time, the special counsel found that the number of African Americans that police dogs bit increased 33%. 234. Such incidents of police brutality led to community protests that, in turn, sometimes continue brutality by police. 235 The beating of Rodney King by the LAPD is one such example. 236 On March 3, 1991. Stopped his car after leading LAPD officers on a pursuit. 237 officers beat Rodney King and were captured on video. 238 The officers were charged but, despite strong video evidence against the officers, were ultimately acquitted. 239 So at least some evidence that law enforcement gangs, which are groups of peace officers within an agency that engage in a pattern of on-duty behavior that intentionally violates the law, are fundamental principles of professional policing. 240, such as those alleged in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, have exacerbated the brutalization of African Americans by law enforcement in California. 241 In 1990, at least 75 Linwood residents filed a class action lawsuit alleging that the Sheriff's Department allowed the Vikings, a Sheriff's Department deputy gang, to carry out racially motivated violence in the community. 242 Angeles County, which is the state and country's most populous county, 243 as of April 2022, police have killed 964 people since 2000. 4% of whom were black, even though African Americans comprised only 8% of the population during that time. 244 Los Angeles police have also historically appeared to ignore the disappearance of black women. 245 Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was believed to have murdered several black women and girls in the Los Angeles area. 246 He was not arrested and convicted until 2016, due to what activists believe was police neglect. 247 The Bay Area, police brutality became such a concern that the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which later became the Black Panther Party, formed to provide protection to African Americans from the police during the 1960s. 248 Two young activists, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Brutality against civil rights protesters is part of a long history of police violence. 249 Eventually, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense evolved into an organization that provided several other services to the community, such as medical clinics and free breakfasts for children. 250 In fact, Panthers even engaged in forms of counter-mapping, which is a form of activism in which marginalized groups use maps to challenge inequality, to propose the creation of new police districts in Berkeley, California. 251 In the San Francisco Bay Area, according to a study, 7% of the people police killed were black, even though they only comprised 7% of the population at the time. 252 Discrimination by Californian police against African Americans is not limited to large police departments like the Los Angeles Police Department and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. According to analysis of traffic stops by the San Diego Police Department from 2014 to 2015, are more likely to search and question black drivers than white drivers, even though officers were less likely to find them with contraband. 253 An evaluation of 2016 to 2018 data showed that both the San Diego Police Department and Sheriff's Department were more likely to stop, search, force against African Americans and people with disabilities than 254 Further, African Americans were 3 times more likely than white people to be arrested by the police department for drug possession, even though research shows that black and white people use and sell drugs at similar rates. 255 The police department also stopped African Americans at a rate 3 times higher than white. 256 Both agencies used higher levels of force against African Americans compared to other groups. 257 Both agencies used more severe levels of force against African Americans than white people at every level of alleged resistance. 258 Fatal shooting of Stephon Alonzo Clark by members of the Sacramento Police Department. The Attorney General conducted a review of the Sacramento Police Department's policies, procedures, and training regarding the use of force. Issued 2 reports to help guide the police department's reform efforts. 259 California's rural and suburban regions, the California Attorney General has investigated 260 and secured a stipulated judgment. 261 involving the Kern County Sheriff's Department regarding unlawful practices such as unreasonable use of force, stops, searches, and seizures, and failure to exercise appropriate management and supervision of deputies. The Attorney General has also investigated 262 the Bakersfield Police Department. Secured a stipulated judgment for the police department to strengthen its engagement with the community. 263 The Attorney General is also reviewing the practices of the Torrance Police Department amidst serious allegations of racist text messages, which contained disparaging comments about African Americans, and other discriminatory conduct. 264 The result of community activism and increased nationwide public awareness of police brutality against African Americans in 2020 in particular. California has recently taken steps to attempt to address the numerous concerns with policing. In the state assembly, Bill 89 raises the minimum qualifying age to be a police officer from 18 to 21 years of age and sets other minimum qualification requirements for peace officers in an effort to reduce uses. Force 265 Assembly Bill 750 makes it a crime for a police officer to make a false statement to another peace officer if that statement is included in a peace officer report. 266 Assembly Bill 1506 requires the California Department of Justice to investigate and review for potential criminal liability. Officer-involved shootings that result in the death of unarmed civilians in the state. 267 Senate Bill 2 creates a process to decertify police officers for misconduct. Such officers from being able to join any another agency in California. 268 California was one of only 4 states without that power. 269 Assembly Bill 118 creates pilot programs to allow community organizations to respond to 911 calls rather than police. 270 Assembly Bill 26 requires officers to intervene if they witness another officer using excessive force. Requires officers to report the use of force and prohibits retaliation against reporting officers. 271 But these reforms do not alone address the many years of discrimination African Americans have experienced at the hands of the criminal justice system. Angeles Policy Department, the largest policy department in California and one of the largest in the country, once referred to African American suspects as dog biscuits.